Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. Hey, so special thank you to Chuck, who finished us off in Genesis last week. He did that on really late notice. He got a phone call at like noon on Tuesday to try to teach Genesis. So thank you for doing that on such short notice. I got myself caught up in trying to figure out what to do with 1,000 turkeys, so I was a little busy. But no, thank you for doing that on such late notice, Chuck. Really appreciate you doing that for us. So we are starting Exodus. We are done with Genesis. I didn't think we would ever get through Genesis, and I am just, Exodus is just a holdover to get to Leviticus. That's what I'm really excited about, just to let you guys know. That was a joke. That didn't fall as well as my Hillary Clinton joke on Sunday, but just, okay. Let's get to God's Word here. Before we get started, I want to show you guys something that's a little bit on my level, and so let's take a look at the screen.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in a famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now, that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down, as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the sons spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites are trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. I mean, it's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
All right, let's go home. So there's just a quick overview of the first half of Exodus. So I kind of like these videos. I don't know, what's it called? The Bible Project videos. They're really good. It's right on my level. So I love watching those videos. So there's an overview of the first half of Exodus. Now we're going to dive in and kind of go verse by verse and get a little bit deeper. And so tonight we're going to look at chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Exodus. It starts like this. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, and they multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, I want to let you guys know that I always teach from the NIV because that's the version that I like. But some of your versions, if you're reading along, might start with a different word than these are the names. It might start with a word like then or and. Anybody's version start like that? Now? Okay. So in the original Hebrew text, the very first word in the book of Exodus is best translated as and. And so it kind of shows us that Exodus picks up right where Genesis leaves off. It's one story. It's just like Scripture is 66 books, but it's one story when you realize it. And so it's interesting that Genesis or Exodus in the original Hebrew starts with this word and, because it's picking up right where Genesis leaves off, albeit kind of fast forwarding a few hundred years. But if you remember, we read the story of Jacob bringing, or Israel, if you will, bringing his sons into the land and settling there. And so this is where we pick up, naming that. But then it says, then Joseph and his brothers died, and that entire generation. Now, where were they living, more specifically? Goshen, right? And you remember that they were living in Goshen because of Joseph, because he was so good to the king, or to Pharaoh, and did such a good job that when his family came, they convinced Pharaoh of how good they were and how good Joseph was. So he gave them this land, and basically because of Joseph's faithfulness, they were allowed to have this land. And if you remember, there was a scene where Jacob actually blesses Pharaoh, and Pharaoh allows him to bless him. So there was Pharaoh thought a lot of this family to give them this place. And so what's interesting is if you study the Egyptian culture in that time, I don't want to use the word racist, but they wanted to stay ethnically pure, if you will. And so Egyptians weren't necessarily all that fond of intermingling with other people groups. And so when they gave the land to the Israelites, they pretty much stayed to themselves, and there wasn't a whole lot of intermarrying going on at that time. And it says that they multiplied and they increased in number. And what's interesting is as they're multiplying and increasing in number, most of this multiplication and increasing in number is Israelites within their own race, if you will, or ethnicity. They're not outside, they're not like intermarrying. So a lot of people say if they would have stayed in Canaan, they probably would have had all sorts of different intermarriages. But actually in God's providence, bringing them to the land of Goshen, they were kind of forced to be secluded. And so as they were growing within that culture. Does that make sense? And so it's interesting. One of my favorite guys that I read in commentaries, David Guzik, said this. He said, Egypt was like the mother's womb for Israel with their rapid growth. So when they went to Egypt, it was actually this place where they started growing in huge numbers and very fast. And so it's just interesting that happens there. And then it ends by saying basically Joseph and his brothers die, and that entire generation dies. And so we pick up in verse 8. It says, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithon and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So what happens is Joseph, who had pull with Pharaoh because of what he had done for the Egyptians, now dies. His brothers die. His immediate family, if you will, passes away. A generation passes away. New leadership happens in Egypt, and they forget what Joseph did for them. And they look at these people not with fondness and saying, remember their ancestor Joseph, who pretty much saved our land. They look at them and say, look at these people. Remember, they're different than them. They're not intermingling with them. Look at these people. They're growing so fast. There's so many of them. They're in such close proximity to us that we have a fear now of them because maybe they were a little, they didn't like other cultures that much at that time. They didn't like them. They were afraid of them. They were afraid that if their enemies attacked them, they would join them. And so what do? They decide they're going to put them in slave labor. They're going to enslave them and work them. Rather than kill them, put them to work. And so they forgot what Joseph did for them. They enslaved the people. And what's interesting is there are some ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics that actually show that actually show the Egyptians like enslaving people and having them make bricks and building things. And so you can see some of this in some of the ancient hieroglyphics that people find that they enslaved the Israelites. Not everybody's sure about how long that they were slaves. There's estimates that go from like 130 years to about 280 years. Not sure how long they were enslaved, because they weren't enslaved until after Joseph died and a generation passed away. But I want to remind you of this. It says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Does that sound familiar? Like it's kind of, when you look at the New Testament and the church and the persecution, the more the church was persecuted, the more the gospel spread. The more they were oppressed, the more God blessed them, right? The more the enemy came against them, the more they seemed to be blessed. And so it's interesting that as they spread, they're multiplying as they're being oppressed. It says, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Strong women. So, Pharaoh says, kill all the boys. Kill the boys, let the girls live. Why kill the boys and let the girls live? Boys carry the seed. What? They can't what? Can't reproduce. But you could kill girls and they couldn't reproduce. They can't fight them. That's kind of what I was thinking, right? Like, why the boys, not the girls, right? And I was thinking, well, if they let the boys grow up, they'll end up being warriors and be strong and fight. And so he says, kill all the boys. And then it says that the midwives do not do it. Now, do they lie to Pharaoh, or do you think the Hebrew women were stronger and more vigorous? They lied. You know some Hebrew women? Oh, no. Oh, okay. So, I don't know. Maybe the Hebrew women were more. Go ahead. I thought we were supposed to be subject to our government. That sounds like a sermon that was preached recently. So when the head of the state tells you to do something that God prohibits you to do, you have to say no, right? And so they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Pharaoh could have had them killed, but they still feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And so we see kind of civil disobedience right here. And I love that it says they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And as believers, there is probably going to be a time coming sooner than later that we have to make sure that we fear God more than we fear those that are in authority over us, because we have to make a decision whether we're going to follow God or follow authority. Follow the authority. Be subject to those that govern us as long as it is not against God. Okay? So I'm not saying be an anarchist. I'm just saying if it goes against God, you guys know what I'm saying. Okay. It says, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. I read in my studies this week that a lot of times the women that were selected to be midwives as their occupation, the reason why they were a midwife was because they couldn't bear children themselves. And so they couldn't bear children, so they helped women bear their children. And so we see a miracle that happens here because it says, and because the midwives feared God, God gave them families of their own. And so you see God actually blesses them for fearing God more than Pharaoh. Pretty interesting, huh? See, well, they were doing it. They were probably in fear of their lives, but God says, no, I'm going to bless you because you care more about me than you care about what they're telling you to do. I just find that really interesting. And so yeah, it's kind of hidden there if you don't understand the context, but I think we see a miracle here where God opens up their womb where it was closed before because they allowed other women to have their children. Verse 22 says, then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. You know, we have a tendency, and I have a tendency sometimes to look at the world around us and say, man, it's never been this bad before. But it's been this bad for a long time, right? Throw the baby boys in the river. And so I just want to remind you guys, as bad as it gets, there's been evil since the beginning. And we shouldn't feel too bad for ourselves because those that came before us in the faith dealt with just as great of evil as we deal with. And they stood for God in the midst of it, and we can do the same thing no matter what comes our way. That's chapter 1. Let's go to chapter 2. Ooh, I'm flying. I might get done earlier than Chuck did last week. Chapter 2 has got a little bit more meat in it, but so let's keep going. It says, now a man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Oh my goodness, we have another person disobeying the order of the government. Now, it's interesting that it says a man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. So we have a Levite marrying a Levite. Remember we said earlier, because of their proximity to each other and because they were kind of in the same area and because there wasn't a whole lot of outside influence, we see a Levite marrying a Levite within the same, right, within the same family. So what is the role of the Levite? Priest, right? So we know Levite is a priest. We kind of learned that when Jacob was blessing his sons, and he blesses Levi and talks about, the priestly line will come from that. Now, I just want to share this with you because I think it's funny. On Sunday, I talked a little bit about some of the rabbinic writings that kind of bring a little bit more insight or legend or whatever to the scriptures, and we don't take it as scripture, but it's just something interesting. This is something that I do not believe at all because later on as we read, you'll see that it can't be true. But there's a Jewish legend that says that at Moses' birth, it was painless to his mother, that at his birth, his face was so beautiful that the room was filled with light equal to the sun and the moon combined. And he walked and he spoke when he was 1 day old. And that he refused to nurse, eating solid foods from birth. Pretty interesting. We're going to see him cry and nurse in the next few verses, so it's kind of weird, but I just thought I'd share that with you. So we see that we have this baby boy. He's being hidden for 3 months. It says, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying. I thought he didn't cry, but anyway. She felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." I'm going to read something word for word that I took out of an article from the Hebrew University about this. It's kind of interesting. I think you guys would want to hear this. It says, when Moses was a baby, his mother put him in a basket and sent it floating on the Nile in hopes of saving his young life. In the original Hebrew, Moses was not put inside a basket, but rather inside an ark. The word is teva in Hebrew. It's the same concept as the story of Noah in Genesis, and these are the only two references in the entire Hebrew Bible to this unique term, teva. This fact has drawn the attention of some Bible commentators. One of the more interesting interpretations suggests that the ark, unlike a ship or a boat, has no ability to determine the way it goes. The inability to navigate or chart a course means that the ark is dependent completely on the divine providence to make sure it will reach its true destiny. The commonality is precisely what Noah's ark and Moses' ark had in common. Both were guided by divine providence to mark the beginning of a new phase in history, the aftermath of the great flood and the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt. And so all that to say, there's only two places in the Hebrew Bible that this term is used, and it's for the basket that Moses goes in and for the ark that Noah goes in. Just thought that was interesting. Thought I'd share that with you guys. So what? Yeah, you're quite welcome. So not only does Moses get spared, and kind of like, if you're like me, when I'm preparing for this and when I'm reading the Bible and I read a chapter over and over again, I kind of think like, what's going on beyond what we just read? Because if you're like me, sometimes I read stuff, and then I get done reading it, and I don't even know what I just read. And then I got to read it again, because my mind was thinking about something else, but my eyes were reading. Anybody ever been there, right? So I read this a few times, and I was kind of thinking this, only because I have 3 kids, and they do this kind of stuff to me all the time. I'm wondering if the reason why she put him in a basket and put him in the Nile, follow me on this, you're going to think I'm silly, but they were supposed to throw the babies in the Nile, and I'm thinking, like, if Pharaoh came after her, somebody came after her for doing this, she'd be like, I did what you told me to do. I put him in the Nile. That's what my kids do to me, like, they, anyway, so. That's the way my brain works when I read this stuff. That's what I was thinking. She's like, I didn't do anything wrong. You just said throw him in the Nile. You didn't say I couldn't put him in a basket that floats. Okay, so here's the cool thing. So not only does Moses get saved, his sister goes and sees Pharaoh's daughter with her younger brother and says, should I get one of the Hebrew ladies to nurse the baby for you? And she says, yes. So she takes him back to his mom, and his mom gets paid for taking care of her own baby. God's cool when he does stuff like that. Now, culturally, it would have been normal for Moses to nurse for 2 years. So we can kind of guess and assume that Moses was living at home with his own mom, she being paid to take care of her own baby for about 2 years before she gives him back to Pharaoh's daughter. And here's the interesting thing. We don't get any information about anything that happens in Moses' childhood. The very next verse picks up basically 40 years later. So the only information we get in Acts chapter 7. It says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So we recognize that Moses was indeed, according to Acts chapter 7, educated in the Egyptian system. So he had an advantage, if you will, over the other Hebrew men at the time because he was being educated in the household of Pharaoh. Also in Acts chapter 7, it tells us that he was 40 years old when verse 11 starts. So we see Moses as a baby. We see him getting floated down. We see him being nursed, given back to Pharaoh's daughter, and then we don't hear about Moses again until he's 40 years old. So that's where we pick up now. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and seeing that, looking this way and that, he's seeing no one. Oh, looking this way and that. Okay. I went to public school. Okay. So he looked this way and that. And he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed that Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So Moses is 40 years old. He realizes that he is Hebrew. He must know this somehow. Maybe Pharaoh's daughter told him that he was adopted. Maybe he went and met his mom. Maybe we don't know all this information. We just know he knew he wasn't Egyptian. He was definitely Hebrew, even though he was raised Egyptian. One day he's walking around. He sees that one of his Hebrew fellow brothers is being beaten by a Egyptian slave master, and he kills the Egyptian and hides the body. And then the next day he goes out and says something to some Hebrews, and they're like, "What are you going to do? Kill us like you killed that Egyptian?" And they were like, "We're going to go tattletale Pharaoh on you." And so what does he do? He runs to a place called Midian. And what's interesting here is you got to feel for Moses at this time. He kind of wants to do the right thing. Probably shouldn't have killed a guy, but he kills the Egyptian, and then now the Hebrews are also like, "Hey, are you going to kill us too?" And so now in a sense, he's been rejected by not just the Egyptians, but also by the Hebrews. So it's like he's got nowhere to go. He can't go back with the Hebrews because they're not happy with him. He can't go back to the Egyptians. They know that he killed somebody, so he has to go off to a place. It says in Hebrews chapter 11 about this, it says, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward." And so we see that so many names. Moses realized that he is an Egyptian and he is a Hebrew, and he would rather do the right thing and be counted as them rather than an Egyptian and all the treasures that are there. So he runs to a place called Midian. Midian is kind of southeast of where he was in Egypt. It's in like modern day area of part of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, east of the Red Sea. So he runs to this place. What's interesting is this is pretty much the only place he could run to, because if he would have went in any other direction, most of those cities and areas were friendly with the Egyptians, and they probably would have ratted him out, and he would have got taken back and killed by Pharaoh. So he goes to this place called Midian, and he sits down at a well. In verse 16, we pick this up. He says, "Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock." He must have been a pretty brave dude. Like we think he's kind of a wimp sometimes because he's afraid to go in front of Pharaoh. But he kills an Egyptian, and then he runs these guys off. Something else that's interesting, somebody that's smarter than me, I just thought of this, it's not in my notes. It said in Acts chapter 7 that he was mighty in words and deeds. What does that mean? Okay. My thought was if he was mighty in words and deeds, doesn't later on he says he's not good with his words? He says that. Yeah, I just thought of that. I wish I had more time to study that out for you guys. He was trained, but maybe, yeah. Interesting. Just thought of that. But hey, so he goes to Midian, sees these women that are there. They're drawing water. Shepherds come in, and they're mistreating them and driving them off. So he rescues them, and he waters their flock. When the girls returned to rule their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian," not a Hebrew, "an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." So, ancient hospitality was a lot different and better than hospitality today. If you rescued somebody, you better invite them in to have something to eat, right? So he's like, "Why didn't you invite him in? Why didn't you bring him to eat?" A couple things I want to ask here. It says in verse 16, it says, "Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters." Most scholars would believe that this is a priest of God, like a somebody that is actually worshiping God, because they would assume that this priest is a descendant from one of Abraham's other children through Keturah. Because in Genesis 25, it says Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Something like that. Anyway, one of the sons' names was what? Midian. So this is probably where Midian settled. And so they're descendants from Abraham from his other wife. Make sense? So they probably knew God in a sense. So hospitality, invite him in. It says, so Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter. So Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter, how do you pronounce her name? Zipporah. Good, thank you. To Moses in marriage. Zipporah, see, if you mispronounce it, it's okay. If I do it, it's wrong. Okay. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So we see Moses runs to Midian. He meets a nice family. He gets married to a nice girl. And during the time while he's out there, Pharaoh dies. And just like the Pharaoh that was on the throne when Joseph was there dies and forgets about Joseph and the great things he's done, the Pharaoh that's in charge that wants to have Moses killed dies off, and Moses is probably not a fugitive anymore. They kind of probably forgot about wanting to kill him, and so he might be a little bit more in the clear at this point. But what I want to focus on here just for a second is at the very end here, it says, so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So God never forgets his covenant. He never forgets his promises. He says that he remembers them. It says the covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And Jacob's been dead for over 400 years at this point. And God still says, you know what, I remember that covenant, and it's time to start moving on this. And 400 years is a long time, and but God doesn't forget his promises. And so some of us, sometimes we hate waiting on God. Hopefully we don't have to wait 400 years. But God remembers his promises. And when it says he remembered and had concern for them, it's not like he forgot and then all of a sudden he remembered, because God doesn't forget. It's just the way that it's written in here. But God's going to use this entire situation with Moses in order to deliver his people. And it's probably, these next chapters are some of the greatest stories in all of the Bible. Maybe we can watch, what's that movie? Is it called Moses? The 10 Commandments. We can watch the movie. Charlton Heston, right? If I don't feel like studying that week, we'll just pop in the VHS. Do we even have a VHS player? You don't even know what a VHS is. Okay, good. I'm joking. All right, so that's chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Exodus. The big thing of the story is it really kind of, what it does is it shows us Moses' birth, fast forward 40 years, and then we're going to get another fast forward, another 40 years, and we're going to kind of pick Moses up when he's 80 years old next time we see him. So God uses him at 40. Hey, I'm 41. God can use me. And God uses him at 80. Any 80-year-olds in here? Jim, yeah. But God can use you at 40. He can use you at 80. He can use you at any point in your life. And so we're going to see God's big rescue plan for Egypt. We got some time tonight, so